What's up everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to make some sick car lighting scenes. Don't worry, I don't really speak like that. Recently I've been carrying on with some of my work on my Blender lighting product. And the product is a combination of things. So there's like diegetic lighting sources, like invisible things that provide light to a scene that aren't actual lamps. There's like preset lighting templates for studio presentation pieces, like if you're doing product visualization. There's some for character stuff. And there's also studio environments like what we're seeing here on the screen. The thing is, when calibrating scenes like this, I knew it would be important to try using objects in situ, meaning in scene. So actually having a real context like automotive visualization to try and help balance the values of the scene or just see how they would actually be useful when put into other people's hands. So I did some playing around with these scenes and I just shared a few experimental things on social media and they got quite a lot of attention. I was surprised with how much people resonated with the car imagery. And for reference, this car model here, the Porsche, is by Black Snow on Sketchfab. They have a nice variety of objects there and you can download a lot of them as well. So I highly recommend taking a look. I did some adjustments to the materials and some very small mesh changes, but they're great objects for testing these lighting environments. Anyway, a lot of people were interested and I got a couple of requests to show people how to do stuff like this, because when you're starting from scratch in Blender with a basic scene, it's kind of hard to visualize how you get to a result like this. It's actually surprisingly easy to get a lighting setup like this, and I'll show you how to get there. This won't exactly be a step-by-step, but I'll give you the breakdown. And before we do get into it, I will say that I've got more behind the scenes stuff on this product and these scenes and the series for my YouTube members and patrons. You can track the exclusive content on my website, codasol.online/members. So if you want a bit more behind the scenes, there's stuff there as well. So basically every studio scene here, as we can see, is effectively just a cubic room. So you're just working with planes, putting planes together. Obviously it's a little bit more than just planes. It's what you do with them. But one of the kind of hidden benefits of starting from an actual room is that it gives you a base for lighting that you don't have to simulate with regular lamp objects, say if you were starting with nothing. So actually when lighting complex objects like cars, one recommendation I would give is, rather than just start putting lighting objects around it, is build a small environment first. I mean, a lot of people work with external or exterior or architectural scenes with cars, which also works really, really well because you get the reflections of that architectural scene on like the windows of the cars. But for something like this, a bit more stylized, build any old room out of planes and start playing with reflections. Let me make a copy of this studio scene and I'll modify it to kind of give you a bit of a step-by-step. So I'm going to call this one Studio Test, and let me just make individual materials for each of these so I don't mess up my linked materials with the other studio rooms. Test floor, test wall, and I'm just going to reset all of these back to just a regular principled BSDF shader. So far I've reset the floor and the walls to just a regular principled BSDF, and this still looks good, right, for lighting? And that's because the ceiling is slightly more complicated. There's actually a few layers in the ceiling light. This is one of my intuitive designs, right, for the product. So there's a lighting layer, which is basically just a bunch of box objects with emissive light, and then there's a glass layer, and you can control the colors of these independently and the reflection values as well. So with the glass, you can control how much light comes through from the emission layer. You don't really need this, so for the sake of simplifying things, let's just work with the lower layer, effectively the plane of the ceiling. I'm going to call that test ceiling. So every surface in our studio now is basically plane, which is why there's no light in it, because it's an enclosed room. But what I'm going to do is, in the emission settings of the ceiling, I'm going to scroll up a bit. So now our ceiling plane is giving us a bit of lighting. There's not much interest going on there because there aren't many patterns, but we get a nice distribution of light across the car, and you can start seeing the reflections of the basic studio room on the curvature. And one thing that's nice about this is, again, we haven't really put any effort into the room other than just setting up planes, but we can already see differences in the intensity here. So you get a bit of a gradient coming with the reflection. One of my friends on Discord, Lena, emphasized to me the importance of the horizon for cars. So effectively, if you're lighting cars, one really nice thing to do is accentuate the kind of horizontal element of it, which is why when we go back and have a look at the previous renders I did, the very moody ones, you see that there's like an emissive line kind of going along the side. One thing you can do in a studio environment like this is perhaps take a wall and adjust it, and we'll start to see here, like on the base of the car, that it is reacting to what we're doing in the rest of the scene. This isn't really accentuating the sides as much, but it is providing a difference in color. And again, if we change the emissive color from above, then that's also providing a different mood. So getting interesting lighting on a subject like this is really just the art form of combining the material properties of each side of the studio and their light producing qualities, and then also throwing in a few extra goodies. What I mean by goodies are invisible lights that kind of hang around in the scene, providing a bit of an illusion of lighting on the surface. So let's do something with this. I like to tend to make my walls a bit reflective in scenes like this. So I've got the metallic up and the roughness down. Let me just make that bright. So I'll make that pure white. We're starting to see that we're getting reflections of the car here. And if you're wondering why the scene's a little bit angled, it's because the camera I was using is a bit angled as well. So let me just reset that. Another interesting thing you'll notice here is that when we make the walls reflective, the ceiling becomes infinite pretty much if it's consistent. So even though we're in a limited room, we're starting to see what's effectively an infinite mirror room. And the corners, lower corners here are accentuated because I've got a very tiny skirting object, which you probably won't have if you're building this from scratch. You don't need it, but I do have something there, and it's just a leftover from when I was building these scenes. I'm going to keep it there for now. It's not required. And again, just showing how different sides of the car affect it. If we grab the floor and change the color there, then again, you know, get to see the color change. So now let's make the floor slightly more reflective by reducing the roughness there. You don't have to go all the way by, you know, turning up the metallic and making it a complete mirror, but I like making things partially reflective in the way that it helps light bounce around a bit more. Now, one thing that's interesting we can do with a ceiling that's providing light is we can do a gradient or something similar to that. So let's make a color ramp, and we're going to plug that into the color. Now, we can scrub this back and forth, but Blender doesn't really know how we want to construct the geometry of the gradient. So to tell it that, we're going to need to do a bit of mapping. What I'm going to do is bring in a texture coordinate node, and maybe I will separate the XYZ of the object space. So we're taking the object of the ceiling plane, and we're saying, okay, let's take the X direction and turn that into a gradient. As we're doing that, we'll see that the mapping's a bit wrong because it's only really applying to the edge here. Let's see what the Y does. Not much. Looks like it's only doing the far side. It might be difficult to see on the video. And the Z in this case is the wrong axis, so it's going up and down. I quite like Y, but the gradient is just kind of packed in on the corner there. You can try other combinations like generated. This may or may not make a difference. Looks pretty much the same. You can also try applying the scale and see if that makes a difference. But one little quick hack workaround for getting the gradient to stretch across the entire ceiling is just to add a bit of a math node here beforehand. And depending on the direction, you can add or subtract value, which is going to adjust it like that, or multiply. But in this case, because we have the gradient right there, I'm going to use divide, which is effectively, we're just going to divide it. So it's going to stretch it more across the scene. So let me make it equal on the color ramp here. And effectively, if I move to the front, I just want to stretch it across the entire room. I'd say that gradient is pretty much hitting the entire room now. Maybe that's a bit too far. You can kind of do a bit more testing by adding new colors in the ramp, but you can see that as you start playing with the ramp here like this and these gradients, then it gives us a bit more complexity in the lighting. Now I'm going to take one of my cameras and now think about, okay, how do I want to pose this around the car? Sometimes I quite like the idea of posing at the back and then showing a little bit more about what's in the distance there, but that's kind of up to you. It would be kind of cool if we had some emission there coming through the reflection of the car. So let me take a look at the materials for this. Also, we can have the real-time compositor enabled by clicking on this drop-down in the top right here and ticking always. My compositor is a mess at the moment, just balancing like different viewport and render versions of the bloom node. But if you grab a glare node and set that to fog glow, if you then plug your render layers, so take the image from your render layer, plug it into the image, and then take that as your output to the compositor, then you will be able to get the fog glow. Again, I would show you all of that in detail, but I don't really want to mess up my scene because this is my actual product file. So I don't want to start damaging things too much for the sake of a tutorial. Now, a little bit of bloom goes a long way with like emissions and stuff like that. So that's quite fun. Let me play a bit more with the ceiling lighting. You'll find very quickly that by playing with light and shadow areas and different aspects of color that you'll get very different moods. So depending on the kind of mood you want to present, try a bunch of different things. Complementary colors would be pretty interesting. It's also quite fun like changing the color of car paint because that also contributes to a different mood. I'm going to stick with red on mine, I think, but I'm going to make the top something blue because I always like working with blues and purples. So let's brighten that up a bit. Whoops, a bit too much bloom there. I kind of like going for slightly darker scenes, I've noticed, because if we start using extra invisible light objects to accentuate the curves of the cars, that's where the real character comes in. Just playing around with the camera angle a little bit more. Maybe I'll focus a bit more on just this car for now, because you can always experiment with like different positions and angles. So clicking on the floor again, we can always play around with reflections and notice how that changes things. I'll make it darker so we're getting a bit less bounce lighting, or again, a bit more color for a mood change. Oh, actually, a little bit of dark red's not that bad here. like kind of orangey. If you don't want to be distracted by reflections in the background, again, look, we can increase the roughness. And as we do that, we can kind of blur it a bit with the ceiling there. Notice how playing with the gradient of the lighting on the ceiling and the roughness of the back wall can give us a bit of a gradient there in terms of color. The skirting object I have along the ground is kind of ruining that, so maybe this is a good time to remove it. So let's just hide that. Now I'm going to play with that ceiling ramp a little bit more. What if I can add a bit more of a back color, something a bit more bright pinky? So now when looking at this scene, if we rotate around the car, the ceiling has this kind of a bit of a sunsetty, synth-wavy gradient going on back there, leading towards a moment of darkness. And I'd say maybe that darkness helps to outline the car a little bit. Now let's add something a bit more juicy, shall we? So now what I'm going to do is put my 3D cursor somewhere along the base of the car here. We're just going to use it as a bit of a center point, shift a curve, and I'm going to do a circle. I've got the extra curve objects add-on enabled, so you may or may not have this. Let me just go to edit preferences. Under add-ons, I've searched in extra, and there's curve extra objects. There are also extra mesh objects that you can use, but the curve one's pretty handy. I'm going to scale this up a bit and raise it slightly and go into the curve properties. So curves are cool because we can adjust the geometry of it pretty much on the fly. I'm holding shift and increasing the depth of the bevel to make it an actual physical object, and then zooming in, let me just double the resolution preview value, and that'll make it a little bit smoother. Actually, let me set that up to like 40 or something to make it really smooth. Now we're going to turn this into an invisible lighting object that kind of surrounds the car, and to do that, first of all, we'll actually make it a light object. So we'll go into the materials and then give it a name. I'm going to call it test emission. This is also a principled shader. So under the emission value, let's start increasing that. And I can go into the camera view here and take a look. We can see how it's reacting with the scene. Now, you've got to imagine that the object isn't there to start with, but as I move up and down, you can see how the reflection is affecting the car. So how do we make it invisible? Again, very simply, we go to the object properties, then we go down to ray visibility, and first of all, disable camera. So now, when I move this object up and down, you can see the juicy side of reflective lighting. And we can rotate it as well, so we can get pretty much any degree of emissive reflection line over the car as we like. In fact, you can put multiple of them in if you like, so you can get all kinds of different light accentuations over the car. And they don't have to be circles either, you can make them any object you like. So what I'm actually going to do is take this object and add an array modifier to it. I believe that should be Z in this case. Let me increase the Z value and make that something like 3. So we've now got 3 of these ring objects, and I'm going to slightly decrease the strength a bit. So this is how the car looks at the moment. Let's make this a bit more central. So I'm going to take the object and just widen it a little bit so it's kind of more centered on the car. We're going to reduce its intensity in a minute. I noticed I still had one left there, so let me remove that. And we're going to reduce its intensity a bit more through some color control. But just one more note about the ray visibility is that you can control other things. So if you don't like it affecting reflections, you can turn off glossy. You can also turn off diffuse. Notice how that's affecting the ceiling there a bit more. So maybe that would be a good one to keep off if we wanted to isolate it more to the car. You can also disable shadow. That's not going to make too much of a difference for us. Volume scatter. This may be important if we apply some volume to the scene. So you can see here we'll get some volumetrics. If we let that resolve, it makes it a little bit more foggy. You can get all kinds of different moods with that. Now that is really cool, but volumetrics take a bit longer to render. So for the sake of just having a tutorial where you won't have to wait to see the result every time, I'll keep it simple for now. So again, taking the theory of the color gradient on the ceiling and now applying it to this ring light, I'm inside of the material here. And actually, I'll just copy it straight from our ceiling light to start with and plug it into our ring object, and we'll just see what happens. But this time I'm actually going to plug it into not just the emission, but also the alpha value. Now, nothing has actually changed so far, but that's also because our math node here, our divide, was kind of set up to stretch across the entire ceiling, and this is a much different object. So I'm going to set that to 0 and then play around a little bit, and we'll start to see some changes happen. In this case, we might not even need the math node, so let's just bypass it entirely and plug the Y into the color ramp, and then take a look, and we will see the gradient color change happening here. Now, because we've got it plugged into the alpha as well as the emission color, you'll notice that it's becoming invisible here. Now, the object is already invisible. What we're actually looking at is the reflection of the object on the floor. If I select it and make it visible to the camera again, you will see this gradient much more clearly on the object. Now, maybe you want to have visible emissive objects like this. As you can see, it'll make kind of like a cool animation. But for me, I'm going to keep that disabled. Now, I don't like there being white, so I'm going to set that to something blue. I might actually use the math node to balance out the gradient distances a bit more. So let me go to add, and if I add this, there we go, shortens it out a bit. What I'm effectively doing is just building up like a ring of a color change based on lighting preferences that I like. And then once I'm happy with the gradient, I can increase the strength of the emission however I like. And you'll start to see it reflect on the car there. You'll notice that because we have the reflection of the light on the ground, I can move the object above and below if I like, but the further I move it away, the more blurred it becomes as well. So you can use that creatively if you want. But I think having a little bit of it there is kind of nice. And as we zoom into different angles for the car here, you might start to be inspired for kind of like new compositional angles or even like new ways to light it. So we can start to think about like where on the horizon of the car lines should be placed. And you'll see that because we've got the gradient, if I rotate it, the lighting will change. So what that means is you can effectively rig your light rigs, I suppose, with these objects and animate them around or even just move them around a pivot to, again, kind of inspire yourself into a different lighting direction. So like I could focus now over here and we can see the reflections going on. So how are we feeling so far? Is that enough to kind of explain the process? 2560... 1080. Let's do something ultra wide now. This isn't really a tutorial about composition more than lighting, but you know, going for different aspect ratios when displaying like complex curvature can make a big difference to the mood. So I recommend continually playing around with color and always keep in mind again the nature of bounce lighting. So even though we can't see much of a change on the floor, as I'm increasing and decreasing the brightness of the orange floor, we'll see that it's reacting with the red color on the actual car. So I'm just gonna improv a little bit here and play around. If I play with the reflection on the back wall there, we can start to see the lines existing. Let's bring that back a bit. I like having a sharp emissive line there just along the edge of the car. If I rotate that now, you can see how the pink color starts to dominate that line there. So that's the cool thing about having these gradients. Move it a bit more that way. I'm duplicating the object now, so now we've got twice as many rings, maybe just in case I want to provide like an anti-contrast or something for the back of the car. It's a bit too much at the moment, I'd say, but again, we can like shift colors around. Maybe I'll reduce the array count and I'll actually just keep it on 1. So again, it's almost like we can select curves, you'll notice, that we want to amplify. Maybe if I wanted to put an emphasis on like the actual Porsche text, then I could adjust this so that it does that. So this is a bit of a different perspective with lighting in a path traced engine like Cycles to using regular lamps. You'll notice this is another one of those demonstrations where you feel like you have more control structurally over the light and the reflection. Again, I've only spent about 1 day's worth of time lighting cars. I've never lit cars before. This is a brand new thing to me, but it just felt like an interesting example of a complex object to demonstrate how emissive mesh lighting, which is what I'm basing my new product on, Afterglow, can be used to quite easily and quite quickly bring you complex lighting setups without much effort. And I say without much effort because part of the product is effectively setting up these presets for you to use and easily modify so that you don't have to go through the process of, you know, making these scenes or these invisible diegetic objects yourself. Release date, I don't know when. If you've been paying attention to my updates, you'll know that I was a bit delayed with working on the product on account of a pretty complex eye injury, but I'm working on it. You know, I'm just continuing to do experiments, and the more I do them, the more I come up with cool techniques and stuff that I can show. And as I said, a bit more of a behind the scenes look on things is available for YouTube members and patrons. You can follow a bit more of the psychological process of working on a product like this. And that money also effectively helps me to fund working on the product and, of course, distilling the information I learned down into videos like this. So people who are contributing to the members and the patrons are also helping to pay for these tutorials. It's all super mutually beneficial. And I really like this, actually, what I just kind of improved here. It's giving me a bit of a Tron vibe there, you know? I like it. Darkness is something I need to learn to respect a bit more in lighting. I'm so used to playing with lots of light and vibrant colors that, you know, you forget how important darkness is for silhouettes, particularly for reflective objects like this. And just for a bit of fun, we're also used to brake lights being red, but what about slightly different color brake lights? pinky purple. Why not? A little bit of fun. All right, hopefully you found this interesting and maybe you learned something. Again, as I continue to work on the product and as I continue to make things for my members and patrons, I'll try and distill as much as I can down into videos for the rest of you so that we can all benefit from it. And actually, there is something you can play with. I released a startup file a while ago to raise money for medical fees. And there are a few like invisible light techniques available in that. You can watch the related video if you want to take a look. And if you made it this far through the video, then put some kind of car related emoji in the comments. And if you do that, I will see which of you did make it this far. You are the real OGs. So thanks for watching, everyone. Stay safe, and I will see you next time.